Hello, my name is Mayanka. I am accounts and a finance trainer from Uplatz. Today in this class, we will discuss residential status. In the income tax, the calculation of the tax or the calculation of the income which will be taxable under the income tax will be determined on the basis of residential status. Means if there is any person who is the resident of India, if there is any person who is the resident of India, then the total income, then the all the income which earned by such a person, all the incomes which are earned by the person shall be taxable. It shall be taxable in India. Means if there is any person who is the resident of India, then each and every income which is earned by him or which is received by him in India and in anywhere outside India, then such income will be taxable in India. Then such income will be taxable in India. For the example, for the example, Mr. Ram is there. There is a Sesi, Mr. Ram. He is the individual. He is individual, and he is the resident, resident of India. He is the resident of India. He earn following income. Sorry. He earn following incomes and receive. He earn and receive. He earn and receive following income in India. In India and outside India. And outside India. Just like salary income, 2,50,000. House property income, outside India, 3 lakh rupees. And business income, 2,50,000. Capital gain, 1,50,000. 1,50,000. And other incomes, just like 2,75,000. So all the incomes, all his income will be taxable in India. All the income of such a resident, because he is the resident of India. He is the resident of India. Then all the income which is earned by such person shall be taxable in India. It shall be taxable in India. So before understanding or before determining the taxable income or the tax liability of any assessee, it is very much important to know about his status. Means whether he is a resident of India or not, or whether he is a non-resident of India. Because when we understand or when we know that he is a resident of India, then we can easily or we can identify those income. We will identify the all the income which will be taxable in his head. If he is not resident of India, then how we will determine the taxable income which will be taxable in India? So in this class, we will discuss the residential status of the person. Residential status of the person. We will discuss such topic in 2 parts. This is part 1 and part 2 we will discuss in our another class, in our next class. In this class, we will discuss the residential status of the individual. Residential status of individual. So now we will start our discussion on the one of the important topic of income tax, residential status. Residential status, section 6. Section 6 of Income Tax Act, residential status. Residential status of. So before determining the amount of taxable income and before determining the tax amount of tax, it is very much important to determine the residential status of the assessee. It is very much important to determine the residential status of the assessee. For all purpose of income tax, the taxpayer are classified means for all the purpose, whether to calculate the amount of taxable income, whether to calculate the amount of tax liability, or in each purpose, the taxpayer are classified into three parts. Means the taxpayers are classified into three parts, into three categories. Number one is resident and ordinary resident. Number one is resident and ordinarily resident. Number two, resident but not ordinarily resident. And number three, non-resident. Number three, non-resident is that the residential status of any person is classified into three parts, into three categories. Number one category, resident and ordinarily resident. Number two, resident but not ordinary resident. And number three, non-resident is there. For the example, there is a taxpayer Mohan. There is a taxpayer Mohan. The Mohan may be, he may be, number one, resident and ordinarily resident of India. He may be resident or ordinarily resident of India. Or number two, he may be resident. He is the resident of India and non-ordinary. Not ordinary resident of India. And number three, non-resident. Means the taxpayer are classified into three parts to determine the residential status of any person, of any taxpayer. The residential status is classified into three parts. Part number one, resident and ordinary resident. Number two, resident and non-ordinary resident. Number three, non-resident. So first we will discuss who is the resident and ordinary resident, who is resident and non-ordinary resident, and who is the non-resident of India. So the residential status of the person, the residential status of the taxpayer is divided into three parts. So the residential status, section 6 of Income Tax Act. Residential status defined under section 6 of Income Tax Act. First, residential status of individual and HUF, and then residential status of AOP, BOI, local authority and company. First, we will discuss residential status of individual and HUF, and then we will discuss the residential status of firm, AOP, BOI companies, LLPs. So, the individual or the HUF, the individual and the HUF residential status is classified in three parts. The residential status of the individual and the HUF is classified into three broad categories. Number one, resident. Number two, deemed resident, and number three, non-resident. Number one, resident of India. Number two, deemed resident of India, and number three, non-resident of India. And residents of India further divided into two parts. Residents of India further divided into two parts. Resident and ordinarily resident of India. And number two, resident but he is not ordinarily resident of India. And the residential status of the firm, AOP, BOI and the company, LLP is divided into two parts. Resident and non-resident. Resident and the non-resident means in the case of firm, AOP, BOI company, there is only two parts. There is only two classification, whether it may be resident or it may be non-resident. There is no concept of ordinary resident. There is no concept of ordinarily resident. So this is the classification. This is the classification, and on the basis of such classification, means on the basis of this, we will discuss or we will determine the residential status of any individual, of HUF, of the company, and AOP and BOI, so that we can properly calculate the amount of taxable income which will be taxable in the hands of such assessee, which will be taxable in the hands of such a taxpayer or such person. So this is the classification, means this is the classification of residential status of individual, HUF, AOP, BOI, firms and companies. To understand the full residential complex, full residential status, we need to understand who is resident of India, who is non-resident of India, who is ordinary resident of India, and who is a non-ordinary resident of India. So now we will discuss the person who is considered as resident of India, the person who is considered as resident as well as ordinary resident of India, and the person who will be considered as a resident of India but he is not considered as ordinary resident of India, and the person who will be considered as non-resident. So the residential status of the assessee must be ascertained with the reference to the each previous year. In each of the previous year, the determination or the ascertainment of the residential status of each of the assessee is mandatory, because in the current year he is a resident of India. Maybe in the next year he may become non-resident of India. For the example, Mr. Sohan, in financial year 2019-20, he stay in India. All means full year. He stay in India full year. So now he will be considered as resident of India. And now in the next year, financial year 2020 and 21, he stay in India only for the period of for the example 90 days, and after 3 months, and after the period of 3 months or after the 90 days, he went to USA. So in this situation he will be considered as non-resident of India. Is that in each of the year the ascertainment of residential status is very much important. It is very much important because it may be changed, because the residential status of any assessee may be changed. So to determine the tax liability, to determine the taxable income, it is very much important to determine the residential status of the assessee each and every year. A person who is a resident or the ordinary resident in 1 year, he may become non-resident. In this situation, he is a resident of India as well as he is a ordinary resident of India, but in the next year he is a non-resident. So it is very much important to determine the residential status of each and every person in each previous year. Another example, just like there is John, and in the previous year he comes India. On 1st January 2020. He comes India on 1st January 2020. So in this situation, he will be considered as non-resident. In financial year 2020 and 21, means he comes in India on 1st of Feb 2020. Now, in financial year 2020 and 21, he lives in India whole year. He stay in India for whole year or for full year. In this situation, he will become resident of India. He will become resident of India. So, in this situation, we can say that it is very much important. It is very much important to determine the residential status of each and every person in every year, because it will change the taxability, it will change the determination of tax liability, determination of taxable income of the assessee. So it is very much important to determine the residential status each and every person in every year, in every previous year. So now we will discuss who will be considered as resident, who will be considered as non-resident, who will be considered as ordinarily resident, means resident and ordinary resident, and who will be considered as resident but not ordinarily resident. So we will discuss residential status of the individual. Now we will start our discussion on the residential status of the individual. Residential status of the individual. Number one, residential status on the basis of number of days. Residential status on the basis of number of days when the assessee stay in India. When the assessee stay in India is that if there is any person, if there is any person who stay in India, he stay in India, such person stay in India for particular days. So on the basis of these particular days, on the basis of his stay in India, we will determine his residential status. We will determine his residential status. So under section 6, subsection 1, under section 6, subsection 1, an individual is said to be an individual will be considered as resident of India in any of the previous year. He will be considered the resident of India in any of the previous year if he satisfy any one, if he satisfy any one of the following condition, is that a person shall be considered as resident of India if he satisfy any of the following condition. Any of the following condition. Number one, he has been in India during the period of previous year for the period of 182 days or more. Is that if there is any person who he stay in India in the previous year for the period of 182 days or more than 182 days, then such person will become resident. Then such person will become the, or he will be considered as resident of India. Or next condition, or he has been in India during the period of 4 years immediately preceding the previous year, immediately preceding the period of previous year for the total period of 365 days. Means he is in India during the period of 4 years. Just preceding means immediately preceding the previous year for the total period of 360 days. Means he is in India he is in India in India in 365 days, 365 days in just preceding 4 years or more than 365, and he has in India or he stay in India for the period of at least 60 days in the current or relevant previous year. In the current or relevant previous year. Is that if any of the individual who is satisfy any of the condition, then he will become the resident of India. The first condition is that if the person is stay in India for the period of 182 days or more than 182 days in India in the relevant previous year, then such person shall be considered as resident of India. Or if he stay in India for the period of 365 days or more than 365 days during the 4 year immediately preceding the previous year, or and he stay in India or he is in India for the period of at least 60 days in the relevant previous year, then he will become or he will be considered as resident of India. He will be considered as resident of India. Is that we will discuss it by the way of example. For the example, Mr. Mohan, in the previous year 2019-20, in the previous year 2019-20, he lives in India. He is in India from 1st April 2019 to from 1st April 2019 to it is 31st December 2019. Means he is in India in the previous year 2019-20. He is in India from 1st April 2019 to 31st March 2019. Means he is in India for the period of April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November and December. Means more than 182 days. He is in India for the period of more than 182 days. Then Mr. Mohan will be resident of India. For the previous year 2019-20. Means for the previous year 2019-20, he will be considered as resident of India. He will be considered as resident of India. If he stay in India, he is in India from 1st April 2019 and he went to USA on 1st July 2019. And he come back from USA in next year, not in financial year 2019-20. So he stay in India only for the period of April, May, June and only for the period of 91 days. Only for the period of 91 days means he stay in India. He stay in India for the period of less than 182 days. For the period of less than 182 days. But he went there on 1st July 2019. But before that, he was the resident of India, means he lives in India. So it is assumed that he is living in India from very beginning, from starting. So is that he is staying in India more than 365 days in the preceding 4 years. Is that Mr. Mohan, he is the permanent resident of India. Only for the purpose of some work, he went to USA on 1st July 2019. Before that, he is the permanent resident of India. So on the basis of this, he is in India for the period of more than 365 days in the preceding 4 financial year, in the preceding or immediately previous 4 financial year. Is that he is a resident of India on the basis of second condition. On the basis of second situation is that on the basis of first situation, if there is any person he stay in India, if any person stay in India for the period of more than 182 days in the preceding financial year, in the previous year, then such person will be known as person resident of India. And the second condition is that means one condition is required to be satisfied. The second condition is that if there is any person who stay in India for the period of 365 days or more than 365 days in preceding 4 previous year, and he lives or he is in India for the period of at least 60 days. At least 60 days in the relevant previous year, then such person shall be considered as resident of India. So in this situation, in 2019-20, he stayed in India for the period of 91 days and he was the permanent resident of India. So it is assumed that he is in India. He is in India from the very long period and he is in India in 365 days or more than 365 days preceding 4 years. So he will become the resident of India. So he will become the resident of India. Now we will discuss or we will clear it. There is a John. There is a John and he comes in India in the financial year 2019-20. He comes in India in the financial year 2019-20. He comes in India in 2019-20 on 1st 4 2019 and he stay in India till 31st October 2019. He stay in India till 31st October 2019 means he is in India for the period of April, May, June, July, August, September and October. 214 days means he is stay in India. Mr. John, he is stay in India for the period of 182 days or more than 182 days means he is stay in India for the period of more than 182 days. Then Mr. John will become resident of India. John will be resident of India. Resident of India. He will be considered as a resident of India. Next example, he comes in India. He comes in India on 1st April 2019 and he stay in India till 31st July or say 31st July. He stay in India 31st July 2019. So he lives in India. April, May, June and July means for the period of 122 days. For the period of 122 days means it is less than 182 days. It is less than 182 days. But as per the second condition, if the assessee lives in India in the previous year for the period at least 60 days and just preceding 4 years, if he lives in India for the period of 365 days, then he will be considered as resident of India. But Mr. John, he comes first time in India in 2019-20 on 1st April. So it is considered that he is not in India. He is not in India in any of the preceding year. Means in the preceding 4 years, he was not in India. So in this situation, Mr. John will not be considered as resident of India. He will not be considered as a resident of India because he stay in India for the period of more than 60 days in the current or in the relevant previous year, but he is not the resident or he is not stay in India immediately preceding 4 years for 365 days or more than 365 days. So he will not be considered as a resident of India. Another example. John, he comes in India. In 2015 and 2016. Okay. And he lives in India. On 1st July or we say 31st May 31st May 2020. He leaves India 31st May 2020. Now, in the previous year, he stayed in India April and for the period of May. Means only 61 days. He stayed in India for the period of 61 days, means more than 61 days, as well as from 2015, means 15 16, 16 17, 17 18, and 18 19. 4 years. In preceding 4 years, he is stay in India. He is in India. He is in India means he is in India just preceding 4 days, and he lives more than 365 days. He lives more than 365 days in the just preceding 4 financial year, or he stay in India in the relevant previous year more than 60 days. More than 60 days. So he will be considered as residents of India. He will be considered as resident of India. Next example, he comes in India and he leaves India on 15th April 2019. He leaves India 2019. He leaves India on 15th April 2019. Means in the previous year, he stayed in India only for the 15 days. Only for the 15 days. So in this situation, he is not fall in first condition, and he is neither fall in the second condition. He is neither fall in first condition nor in second condition. According to second condition, if he lives in India or if he stay in India for the period of more than 60 days, at least 60 days in the relevant previous year, and 365 days or more than 365 days in just preceding 4 years, then he will be considered as resident of India. He is Mr. John. Comes in India in 2015-16, means he is in India from 2015-16 and he is staying here. So he has stayed here for the period of more than 365 days. But in the previous year, in the relevant year, he is stay in India only for the period of 15 days. Only for the period of 15 days, not for the period of 60 days, more than 60 days. Then Mr. John will not be considered as resident of India. Then he will not be considered as a resident of India. He will not be considered as resident of India. Is that if there is any person, he stay in India for the period of more than 182 days. If any person stay in India for the period of 182 days or more than 182 days in the previous year, then he will become resident of India. Or if he is in India during a period of 4 years, immediately preceding the date of relevant previous year, means he is in India immediately preceding the 4 previous year, and he stay in India in this previous 4 year for the period of 365 days or more than 365 days, and in the relevant previous year he stay in India for the period of at least 60 days, then he will be known as resident of India. So if any of the person which fulfill any of the condition, means first or second, any of the condition is fulfilled by the assessee, then he will be considered as resident of India. Or if any of the condition is not satisfied, then he will be considered as non-resident. Then he will be considered as non-resident, means he will not be considered as resident of India, so he will be considered as non-resident of India. So he will be considered as non-resident of India. If the individual satisfy any of the condition which is mentioned above, then he will be considered as resident of India. Otherwise, he will be considered as non-resident of India. Exception. Now, In the respect of such provision, there are some exceptions. There are some exceptions in the respect of such provision. In the respect of such provision, there are some exceptions. There are some exceptions. The following category of individual, the following category of the individual will be treated as residents in India. Means the following category of the individual will be considered as a resident of India, whether they stay in India only for the period of, means if the period they are staying during the relevant previous year is 182 days or more than 182 days. Is that if there is any person, he stay in India for the period of 182 days or more than 182 days, then such person will be considered as resident of India. Resident of India. The following category of the individual will be treated as resident of India only if the period of their stay during the relevant previous year amount to 182 days or more. Or if he stay in India for the period of 60 days or more than 60 days in the relevant previous year, and 365 days or more than 365 days in just preceding 4 years, then he will be considered as resident of India. But if any of the person who does not fulfill any of the condition, then he will be considered as non-resident. In other words, even if such person were in India for the period of 60 days, they are in India for the period of 60 days or more than 60 days in the relevant previous year, they will not be treated as resident due to the reason that they stay in India for the period of 365 days or more than 365 days during immediately preceding year. Is that if there is any person who lives in India for the period of 60 days or more than 60 days in the relevant previous year, and they stay in India for the period of 365 days or more than 365 days during the 4 immediately preceding year, but they will not be considered as resident of India. Is that they are those person who will not be considered as a resident of India, if they satisfy second condition. Is that if they fulfill first condition, then they will be considered as resident of India. Means in the respect of these person, the first situation is mandatory. Means in the respect of these person, only first situation is there, first condition is there, second condition is not there. If they stay in India for the period of more than 182 days or for the period of 182 days, then they will become resident of India. Otherwise, they will not be considered as resident of India. They will become non-resident of India. They will be considered as resident. They will not be considered as resident of India. Number 1, Indian citizen who leaves India during the relevant previous year as the member of crew of India ship or for the purpose of employment outside India. Is that if there is any person, he leaves India during the period of relevant previous year and he leaves as a crew member of Indian ship or for the purpose of employment outside India. Is that, for the example, Mr. Ram, he is in India. And in 2019-20, he leaves India for the employment, for the purpose of employment in outside India. He leaves India for the purpose of employment in outside India. So in this situation, For the example, he leaves India. He leaves India in 31st July 2019. He leaves India in 31st July on 31st July 2019, means in the previous year 2019-20, sorry, in the previous year 2019-20 or the financial year 2019-20, he stay only for the period of April plus May plus June and July, only for the period of 122 days, only for the period of 122 days. And other preceding years, because Mr. Ram, he is the permanent resident of India. He is the permanent resident of India. And from previous years, he is the resident of India, means he stay in India whole years. But when there is any person who leaves India, when the person leaves India for the purpose of employment, outside India, or as the crew member of Indian ship, then the second condition will not be considered. Second condition will not be here. Means as per the second condition, he will be considered as a resident of India. As per the second condition, he will be considered as a resident of India because he is in India more than 365 days in just preceding 4 years. And he is staying in India in the relevant previous year for the period of 60 days or more than 60 days, then he will consider as a resident of India. But he is leaving the India for the purpose of employment outside India, then second condition will not be available. If he stay in India for the period of 182 days or more than 182 days, then he will be considered as a resident of India. So in this situation, Ram will not be considered as resident of India. He will not be considered as resident of India. He will be considered as non-resident. He will be considered as non-resident because if there is any person who leaves India as a crew member of ship or for the purpose of employment, in outside India, then such person shall not be considered as then to determine the residential status of such person, second condition will not be available. Only on the basis of first condition, we will determine the residential status of such person. If he stay in India for the period of 182 days or for the period of 182 days or more than 182 days, then he will be considered as resident of India. Otherwise, he will not be considered as resident of India. Next point, Indian citizen or the person of Indian origin. Indian citizen or any person of Indian origin who being outside India comes on to visit to India during the relevant previous year. Is that if there is any person, he is the Indian citizen or the person of Indian origin he is outside India and he comes India only for the purpose of visit, means he comes to India on the visit during the relevant previous year. Then if such person stay in India for the period of 182 days, then he will be considered as resident of India. Otherwise, he will not be considered as a resident of India. If there is any person, he is the Indian citizen and he is in outside India. And he comes to India only for the purpose of visit. Then if he stay in India for the period of 182 days, second condition will not be available to such person. If he stay in India for the period of 182 or more than 182 days, then he will be considered as a resident of India. Otherwise, he will not be considered as a resident of India. So is that in the following two cases, these two cases, number one, when there is any person who leaves India as a crew member of any Indian ship or for the purpose of employment, then the second condition. And the second category is when there is any person who is an Indian citizen and he stay
sorry, and he is in outside India, and he comes India only for the purpose of visit, only for the purpose of visit. So in these two categories, in these two situations, the second condition means that the second condition is not available, only first condition is available if he stay in India. If he stay in India for the period of 182 days or more than 182 days in the relevant previous year, then he will become, or he will be considered as resident of India. Then he will be considered as resident of India. So, in such case, however, such person having total income, however, such person having the total income other than the income from foreign source means the amount of income which is earned in India means the total income, excluding the income which is earned outside India means foreign sources. Is that the income? The income which is accrue in India, which is arise in India will be considered. Means there is any assessee means such person. So the income which is accrue in India, which is arise in India, the income which is accrue in India and arise in India, and which is not deemed to be accrue or deemed to be arise in India, exceeding 15 lakh during the previous year will be treated as a resident of India. If is that if there is any person, if there is any person whose total income include Indian income as well as foreign income. Foreign income means the income which is not accrue or not arise in India, which is earn, accrue or arise in outside India. Accrue and arise in India, outside India, except income from the business controlled from or profession set up in India, except the income which is earned from the business, earned from the business which is controlled by, which is controlled from or profession set up by the separate profession which is set up in India, and the income which is not deemed to be accrue or arise in India means foreign income, foreign income. And if such income means if the Indian income, if the Indian income is more than 50 lakh rupees, if the Indian income is more than 15 lakh during the previous year, then such assessee will be considered as a resident of India. Then such person shall be considered as a resident of India if he stay in India for the period of 181, for the period of 182 days or more than 182 days. Is that if such person stay in India for the period of 182 days or more than 182 days in the relevant previous year, or he has been in India during 4 immediately preceding previous year, and he is stay in India in these 4 preceding year for the period of 365 days or more than 365 days, and and he is in India for the period of at least 120 days in the previous year, in the relevant previous year, then such person will be considered as resident. Then such person will be considered as resident of India. Is that for the example? For the example, dear Mr. A, dear Mr. A, his total income, his total income for the example 25 lakh. Okay, his total income is 25 lakh rupees, and foreign income, foreign income for the example 7 lakh 50,000, means the Indian income is 17 lakh 50,000, which is more than 50 lakh, sorry 15 lakh, which is more than 15 lakh Indian income. Indian income is 17 lakh 50,000. The income which is accrue in India, which is arise in India, which is received in India, it will be considered as Indian income. And Mr. A, he is still in India. He is in India in previous year or financial year 2019-20 for the period of for the period of 225 days. 225 days. Then Mr. A will be considered as resident. He will be considered as resident of India. He will be considered as resident of India if he stay in India for the period of more than 182 days or 182 days. Then he will become or he will be considered as a resident of India for the relevant previous year. For the relevant previous year. And if he is in India, he is in India in previous year 2019-20 for the period of 120 or 135 days, for the period of 135 days and 450 days in preceding 4 years. In preceding 4 years, then he will be considered as resident of India. Then he will be considered as resident of India. Is that in the case of such person, both conditions are available. First condition as well as second condition. Any of the condition is satisfied, he will become resident of India. But the current period is 120 days. It is 120 days, at least 120 days in the place of 60 days. At least 120 days. He, in the previous year, he will be in India for the period of at least 120 days. At least 120 days. Is that if there is any person whose total income other than foreign income is more than 15 lakh rupees, and he stay in India for the period of 182 days or more than 182 days in the relevant previous year, then he will be considered as resident of India. Or he stay in India for the period of 120 days or more than 120 days in the relevant previous year, and he stay in India for the period of more than 365 days just preceding 4 previous years, then he will become the resident of India. Means he will be considered as resident of India. He will be considered as resident of India. So this is the another category, means this is the another point of determination of residential status. So how to determine the period of stay in India for an Indian citizen being a crew member? If there is a crew member, he comes in India. So how we will determine his period of stay? Means as per the provision of Income Tax Act, if there is any person, he stay in India for the period of 182 days or more than 182 days, then such person will be considered as a resident of India. But if there is any person, he is a crew member, and he is in India, so how we will determine his residential status? Means how we will determine the period of stay in India for an Indian citizen. So in the case of foreign bound ships, where the destination of the such conveyance is outside India. In the case of foreign bound ships, where the destination is outside India. So then there is the uncertainty regarding the manner and the basis for determining the period of stay in India for the Indian citizen being a crew member. Is that if there is any Indian citizen, he is working as a crew member in the Indian ship, and the destination of such Indian ship is outside India. So how we will determine the number of or the period of stay in India for such Indian citizen, who is working as a crew member. For the example, Mr. Ram, he is working as crew member in an Indian ship. And the destination destination of such a ship is, for the example, USA. The destination of such ship is USA. So, how we will determine the period of stay of such person? Means how we will determine the period of stay of such person in India as a crew member. So, to remove this uncertainty, explanation 2 of section 6 subsection 1 provide that in the case of an individual who is a citizen of India and who is a crew member or who is the member of a crew of a foreign bond ship leaving India, then the period or periods of stay in India shall, in the respect of such a view, be determined in the prescribed manner and subject to the prescribed condition. Means the explanation 2 of section 6 subsection 1 explain that if there is any person who is the resident of India and he is the Indian citizen and he is the Indian citizen and he is the member of he is working as a crew member of a ship of a foreign bond ship and he is leaving India and he is leaving India because destination is outside India. So the period of stay and the periods of the stay of such person shall be determined on the basis of prescribed condition, prescribed situation and subject to some conditions. So means there are some specific condition, there are some specific manner on the basis of which we will determine the residential status or the period of stay of the person who is the Indian citizen and who is working as a crew member, So according to this, the severity by the notification number 70 2015 dated 17th August 2015 insert rule 126 in the income tax rule 1962 to compute the period of stay in such case is that in this case in this situation the severity by the notification insert a rule number 126 Rule 126 and Rule 126 determined or explain how to calculate the stay period of these person, of such an Indian citizen who is working as a crew member. So, according to the Rule 126, if there is any person, if there is any individual and he is working as a crew member of the ship, and he is a citizen of India, then the period of stay and the periods of the stay in the respect of such person, in the respect of an eligible voter, not include the following period is that when we will determine the period of stay of such person, then the following period shall not be included. Number one, period to be excluded means the following period will be excluded. Number one, the period commencing from the date entered into the continuous discharge certificate in the respect of joining of ship by the said individual for the eligible vogue is that the period which is start from the date which is entered in continuous discharge certificate. The period which is entered in continuous discharge certificate in the respect of such joining of the ship by the said individual for the eligible working, and the period ending on the date which is entered into the certificate, into the continuous discharge certificate in the respect of signing off by that individual from the ship in the respect of such working. Means the period which will be start from the date which is entered in continuous discharge certificate in the respect of joining of ship by such a person for such a eligible bookie, and the date or the period which will be end on the date which is entered into the continuous discharge certificate in the respect of signing off by that individual from the ship in the respect of such working will not be included. It will not be included when we will consider the period of stay. When we will consider the period of stay, then the period which will start from the date which is entered in continuous discharge certificate, and the period which will be and the period ending on the date which is entered into the continuous discharge certificate in the respect of signing off will not be considered. It will not be considered. For the example, there is a person, Mr. B, and he joined his journey, or he joined the ship. Means he joined the ship. He joined the ship, for the example, 10th April 2019. He joined the ship on 10th April 2019. And he discharged, or he sign off, and he sign off the ship. Means he is a sign of the ship is, for the example, 31st June, so 31st July 2019. So in this situation means this date is mentioned in certificate. This date is mentioned in certificate. So the following period means from 10th April 2019 to 31st July 2019 will not be included. Will not be included when we will consider the period of stay of Mr. B. Then the period, when we calculate the period of stay of such a person, then the period from 10th April 2019 to 31st July 2019 will not be considered. It will not be considered. Is that the date entered into the continuous discharge certificate in the respect of such joining the ship, and the date or the period ending on the date which is entered on continuous discharge certificate in the respect of such signing of the ship will be excluded. Will be excluded when we will calculate the period of stay. There are some points. Continuous discharge certificate. What is the meaning of continuous discharge certificate? So the continuous discharge certificate has the meaning which is assigned to in the Merchant Shipping Rules 2001, and which is made under the Merchant Shipping Act 1958. Means the meaning of the continuous discharge certificate is defined in Merchant Shipping Rules 2001. Eligible bogie. What is the meaning of eligible bogie? And bogie undertake by a ship engaged in the carriage of passenger or freight in the international tariff, where means a bogie which is undertaken by a ship, and the ship which is engaged in the carriage of passenger or freight in international tariff, where for the bogie having originated from any port in India has as its destination any port outside India. Means the bogie which is start from any port of India, the bogie which is start from any port of India, and the destination is outside India, and the destination is any port which is outside India. And number two, for the bogie having originated from any port outside India but has a destination any port in India, means first go means go in India to the destination is any port outside India, return from such a outside port to Indian port, then such bogie will be known as eligible bogie, and the bogie is carrying the transportation of passenger or transportation of any goods for the purpose of freight in international tariff. So it will be considered as eligible bogie. Now, for the purpose of such discussion means to understand such a concept, to understand the residential status concept, we will understand a example. Or we will discuss an example so that we can easily understand the concept of residential status, whether such person on the basis of such example, whether who will be considered as resident or who will not be considered as resident. Mr. Anand, he is an Indian citizen. Mr. Anand, he is an Indian citizen and he is a member of crew of a Singapore-born Indian ship, which is engaged in the carriage of passenger in international tariff departure from Chennai port on 6th June 2020. Mr. Anand, he is the Indian citizen and he is a crew member in an Indian ship. He is working as a crew member in an Indian ship. And he is departing from China. He is departing from Chennai port on 6th June 2020. He departing from Chennai. He departing from Chennai from 6th June 2021. 2020. He departing from Chennai in June 2021. From the following detail, the previous year 20 and 21, determining the residential status of Mr. Anand. Now, on the basis of such a point, there is a requirement to determine the residential status of Mr. Anand for the previous year 20 and 21. For the previous year 20 and 21, there is a requirement to determine the residential status of such person. Assuming that he stay in India in the last 4 years, he stay in India in the last 4 years is 400 days. For 400 days. So the period from 6th June 2020, this is the departing period. The date entered into the continuous discharge certificate in the respect of joining of ship is 6 June 2020, and the date which is entered from the continuous discharge certificate in the respect of signing of the ship by the Anand is 9th December. So the period from 6th June. 2020 to 9th December 2020 will not be considered. It will not be considered when we will determine the period of stay of such person. Is that when we will determine the period of stay of such person, then the period which will start from the date which is entered into the continuous discharge certificate in the respect of joining of such ship, and the period ending to the date which is entered into the continuous discharge certificate in the respect of signing of the ship will not be considered, means it will be excluded when we will calculate the period of stay of such person. As per the provision or as per the exception case, when there is any person who is an Indian citizen and he leaves India as the crew member of any Indian ship, then in this situation, the second condition is not satisfied. Only condition 1 is available. Second condition is not available. Only condition 1 is available. Is that if such person stay in India, for the period of 182 days or more than 182 days in India in the relevant previous year, then such person will be considered as a resident of India. But in the case of Mr. Anand, when we will consider or when we will determine such 182 days, then the period from 6th June 2020 to 9th December 2020 will not be considered. It will not be considered. Is that in the case of Mr. Anand, he is an Indian citizen and he leaving the India during previous year 20 and 21 as a member of crew of any Indian ship, then he will be considered as a resident of India only when he lives in India for the period of 182 days or more than 182 days for the period of 182 days and more than 182 days. But when we will calculate the period of 182 days, then the date, then the period from signing, sorry, from it is a from joining, sorry, from joining the ship to signing of the ship will not be considered. It will not be considered to determine the residential status, to determine the 182 days of such person, to determine the 182 days of such person. So the bogie is undertaken by an Indian ship and it is engaged in the carriage of passenger in the international tariff, organizing from the port in India and the destination port is outside India, means Singapore. So hence this bogie is to be considered as eligible bogie for the purpose of section 6, subsection 1. So in this situation, when we will determine the period of stay, the period from 6th June 2020 to 9th December 2020 will not be considered. It will not be considered. It will not be considered means it will be excluded. It will be excluded from his period of stay. From his period of stay means he stay in India only for the period of, accordingly he stay in India for the period of 187 days. Means how 187 days? Means he, sorry, according to this question is, according to this question, wait, means the total period is, total period 2019-20 is 365 days. 365 days. And the period excluded, less excluded period. He signing 6 June. So from June, 6th June means 31st, sorry, 25th day of June, July, August, September plus October, November, and sorry, November is 9 days of November. Means 157 days. 157 days. June, July, August, September, October, November. So December. November plus 30 days of November and then 9 days of December. Means 187 days. Means these 187 days will not be considered. These 187 days will not be considered when we will calculate the period of stay. And on the basis of this, he will stay in India or he is in India only for the period of 172 days. He is in India only for the 172 days. Then he will not be considered as a resident, because if he stay in India in the previous year more than 182 days or up to 182 days, means if he is in India for the period of 182 days or more than 182 days, then he will be considered as a resident. But in this situation, he stay in India only for the period of 178, which is less than 182 days. Which is less than 182 days, then he will not be considered as a resident of India. Accordingly, 187 days has to be excluded from the period of his stay in India. So Mr. Anand stay in India only for the period of 178 days, which are less than 182 days, which are less than 182 days. Then he will not be considered as a resident of India. Then he will not be considered as a resident of India. He will be considered as non-resident. He will be considered as non-resident for the previous year 2020 and 21. Means for the assessment year 21-22, he will be considered as non-resident of India. Non-resident of India. So this is the concept relating to the resident of India. This is the concept relating to the resident of India is that if there is any person stay in India for the period of 182 days or more than 182 days in a previous year, then he will be considered as a resident of India. Or if the person resident in India for the period of at least 60 days in a relevant previous year and 365 days or more than 365 days in just a preceding 4 previous year, then he may be considered as he will be considered as resident of India. But there are some exceptions, just like when there is any person leaves India for the purpose of employment outside India or as a crew member of India, as a crew member of India, then second condition will not be available. Then second condition will not be available, and if there is any person who is the citizen of India, who is a citizen of India means he is the Indian citizen, and he comes India only for the purpose of visit, only for the purpose of visit. Then second condition is not available. Only condition first is available. If they stay or if he stay in India for the period of 182 days, then he will be considered as Indian. He will be considered as resident of India. Now we will discuss next point, deemed resident. What is the meaning of deemed resident? What is the meaning of deemed resident? An individual who is the Indian citizen, then the total income other than income of foreign source. If there is any person who is a Indian citizen, then his total income other than foreign income, and which is not deemed accrue or arise in India, means if there is any person who is the Indian citizen, then his total income exclude the foreign income. Foreign income is more than 15 lakh rupees. If it is more than 15 lakh, just like such concept, if it is more than 15 lakh rupees and more than 15 lakh rupees, then such person will be considered as deemed resident. Then such person will be considered as deemed resident of India. If he is not liable to pay tax in any other country or any other territory by the reason of his residence. Means if there is any person whose total income, if there is a person, for the example, Mr. Mohan, he has total income, his total income is 37 lakh rupees. He has total income 37 lakh rupees less foreign income. Foreign income, for the example, it is 12,50,000 rupees. So his Indian income will be 24,50,000 rupees, which is more than 15 lakh, which is more than 15 lakh rupees. Then Mr. Mohan will be considered as a resident of India. Mr. Mohan will be deemed as a resident of India if such income, if his income is not taxable, if he is not liable to pay tax in any other country. Means if he is not liable to make the payment of tax in any other country or in any other territory by the reason of his residence, by the reason of his status, then he will be considered the residential status of, he will be considered as resident of India. He will be considered as resident of India if his Indian income is more than rupees. If it is more than rupees 15 lakh, if it is more than 15 lakh. However, this provision will not apply in the case of individual who is the resident of India in the previous year, as per section 6 subsection 1, is that if there is any person who is resident of India, then he will be considered as resident of India. But if there is any person who is not the resident of India, who is the citizen of India, and his income from Indian source other than a foreign source is more than 15 lakh rupees, then he will be deemed to be the resident of India if he is not liable to make the payment of tax in any other country or in any other territory. So he will be considered as deemed resident of India. He will be considered as deemed resident of India. Next, resident means first the status of the individual or HUF is divided into 2 parts. Into 3 parts. Resident of India, Number 2, deemed resident, and number 3, non-resident. Resident of India is divided further into two parts: resident and ordinarily resident, and resident but not ordinarily resident. So now we will discuss, or we will understand, what is the meaning of resident and ordinarily resident, and the resident but not ordinarily resident. So only in the case of individual and in the case of HUF. Only in the case of individual and in the case of HUF, we will be classify them as resident and ordinarily resident, and resident but not ordinarily resident. Is that if there is any firm or there is any company, the firm and the company, AOP and BOI, are classified only in two parts: resident or not resident or non-resident. Resident or non-resident. But in the case of individual and HUF, we will further bifurcate the resident into resident and ordinary resident, and resident but not ordinary resident. But not ordinary resident. All other classes of the assessee can either be classified as resident and non-resident. A not ordinarily resident person is one who satisfies any one of the following conditions. Is that if there is any person who is the resident of India and he satisfies any of the following condition, if he satisfies any of the following condition, then he will be considered as not ordinary resident. He will be considered as not ordinarily resident. Number one condition is that if such individual has been non-resident in India, such person is a non-resident in India in any 9 out of 10 previous year. If he is non-resident in India any of the 9 previous year out of 10 previous year, just preceding the relevant previous year, just preceding the relevant previous year, he was not resident, sorry, he was non-resident in India in any 9 year out of 10 years, then he will be considered as non-resident. He will be considered not ordinarily resident, means he is resident, but he will be considered as not ordinarily resident. And number second, if such individual has been during the period of 7 years preceding the relevant previous year, being in India for the period of 729 or less, is that if there is any person, he is a resident of India, but he is in India in preceding 7 years, immediately preceding the 7 years, and he is in India in this 7 year only for the period of 729 days or less than 729 days, then he will not be considered as ordinarily resident. He is a resident, but he will be not ordinarily resident. He will be not ordinarily resident. Is that if there is any person, he is in India for the period of 10 years. But out of these 10 years, he is a non-resident. He is non-resident for 9 years. Then he will be considered as a resident and non-ordinary resident, means not ordinary resident. For the example, Mr. Ram, he is in India from last 10 years. But every year, in 9 years, he stay in India only for the period of 90 days. Only for the period of 90 days. So he will be considered as non-resident because he is not in India for the period of 182 days or more than 182 days. Then he will be considered as non-resident. Then he will be considered non-resident for such 9 years. For such 9 years, when he is considered as non-resident for such 9 years, then he will be considered as non or not ordinary resident. Means in the previous year he is a resident, but just preceding 10 years, just preceding the 10 years, out of these 10 years he is a non-resident for the 9 years. Then in such current year, means in such previous year, he will be considered as resident but not ordinary resident. Resident but not ordinary resident. Or next condition, if he stay in India for the period of 7 previous year, and out of these 7 years he stay in India only for the period of 729 or less than 729, means he is in India from last 7 years. And in such 7 years, he is stay only for 550 days. Only for 550 days. Then he will be considered as not ordinary resident. Then he will be considered as not ordinary resident in the current previous year. In the current previous year, he is resident. On the basis of other condition, he is resident, but he will be considered as a not ordinary resident. Not ordinary resident. If there is any individual who is Indian citizen, if there is any person, he is an Indian citizen or he is the person of Indian origin. If there is any person, he is the Indian origin, he is the person of Indian origin or he is the Indian citizen. And his total income excluding the foreign income. If his total income excluding the foreign income from any business or profession is more than 15 lakh. If it is more than 15 lakh during the previous year and he stay in India for the period of 182 days. If he stay in India for 120 days or more than but less than 182 days. If he stay in India for the period of more than 120 days but less than 182 days, then he will consider as a resident of India but not ordinarily resident of India. Is that for the example, Mr. Sohan, his total income for the example 32 lakh and less foreign income for the example it is 8 lakh. So the income will be, Indian income will be 24 lakh, which is more than 15 lakh. He is in India in relevant previous year is for the period of 150 days, means more than 120 days but less than 182 days. More than 120 days but less than 182 days, then he will be considered as resident but not ordinary resident. But he will be considered as resident but not ordinary resident. Or if such individual is an Indian citizen who is deemed to be resident in India under section 6 subsection 1a. Under section 6 subsection 1a means as a deemed resident, is that if such individual is an Indian citizen and he is a deemed resident of India then such person will be considered as a resident of India, but he will not be considered as ordinarily resident of India. he will not be considered as ordinarily resident of India. So in this condition, if there is any person who is a resident of India, if there is any person who is a resident of India, if he satisfy any of these conditions, if he satisfy any one condition from these four conditions, then he will be considered as person resident of India, but not ordinary resident of India. Person resident of India, but not ordinary resident of India, but not ordinarily resident of India. If he satisfy any of the condition, if he satisfy any of the condition. Now, we will discuss it by the way of example. Now, we will discuss or we will understand it by the way of example, so that we can properly understand. We can properly understand it. Key means how we will determine whether such person is a resident of India or whether such person is non-resident of India. Example: Brett Lee, an Indian cricketer, visit India for 100 days in every financial year. He visit in India in every financial year for the period of 100 days. He has been in practice for the past 10 financial years. So find out his residential status for the assessment year 21 and 22. Is that as per the provision of income tax, if there is any person who is stay in India for the period of 182 days or more than 182 days in the previous year, then he will be considered as a resident of India. Or if he is in India for the period of 365 days just preceding financial year, and he is staying in India for the period of at least 60 days in the relevant previous year, then he will be considered as person resident of India. Then Brett Lee is fall in the second situation, because he is in India, he comes India or he visit India for the 100 days, every year. So in the previous year, in the relevant previous year, he lives in India for the period more than 60 days. As well as just preceding 4 years, he stay in India for the period of 400 days, means it is more than 365 days, 100 into 4 years. Then he will be considered as India. He will be considered as resident person, means stay period during the previous year is 100 days. And the condition, and the second, according to second condition, the period of stay during 4 preceding financial is 400 days, which is more than 365 days. 100 in 2000, 1920, 1819, 1718 is 1617, means 400 days, which is more than 365 days. Then Brett Lee will be considered as person resident of India. He will be considered as a person resident of India. Now, there is another point. That he stay in India for the period of, means he is in India in a preceding 10 years, but he is not resident. But he is not resident in India. But he is not resident, means according to the residential status, if such individual has been a non-resident in India out of 9 years, 9 years out of 10 years, then he will be considered as not ordinarily resident. And or such individual has during the 7 previous year stay in India for the period of 729 days, but such Brett Lee is stay in India only for the 700 days for 7 years. And if we consider the first point, then he is not a resident in any year, in 9 years out of 10 years. Is that Brett Lee has been in India for the period of 60 days, more than 60 days during the previous year 20 and 21, and for the period of more than 365 days during the 4 immediately preceding period, then he will be considered as a resident of India. Calculation to determine whether he is a resident, ordinary resident or not ordinary resident. So in the 7 year, he stay for the period of only 700 days, not 729 or more than 729. then he will be considered as not a resident of India. Because if he stay in India, for the period of 729 days, more than 729 days, then he will be considered as a resident and ordinary resident. But he, in the 7 years, in the 7 previous year, he stay only for 700 days. He will be considered as a resident but not ordinary resident. Since his period of stay in India during the past 7 years is less than 730 days. So he is a not ordinary resident during the previous year 2020 and 21 and 22. During the assessment year 21 and 22, he is the resident of India but not ordinary resident of India. So for the previous year or for the assessment year 21 and 22, Bradley will be considered as a resident of India and he will be considered as non-ordinary resident of India. Note, an individual not being an Indian citizen would be not ordinary resident if he satisfies any of the following conditions. If there is any individual, he is not an Indian citizen and he is a not ordinary resident if he satisfies any of the condition. Number one, if such person or such individual has been not a resident, non-resident in India 9 years out of 10 previous year preceding the relevant previous year, or such individual during the 7 previous year stay in India for the period of 729 days or less than 729 days, then he will be considered as a non-resident, non-ordinary resident of India. So in this situation, Mr. Bradley satisfied condition number 2 because he less than 729 days in India in preceding 7 years, in preceding 7 years, then he will be considered as a resident, but he will be considered as not ordinary resident. He will not be a ordinary resident. He will be a not ordinary resident. So on the basis of such example, we have understand how we will calculate or how we will determine the residential status of a person. The second point is that would your answer change if the above factor relate to the Srinath who is an Indian citizen and who resides in India and represent the Australian cricket team? He is the Indian citizen. So in the case of Indian citizen, if the above factor relate to the Srinath who is an Indian citizen and he is in Australia, comes on to visit in India, then he would be treated as non-resident because he is stay in India, because he is in India only for the period of stay in India only for the period of 100 days. Only for the period of 100 days. If there is any person who is the Indian citizen, and such person comes in India only for the purpose of stay, then if such person is stay in India for the period of less than 120 days, then he will be considered as non-resident. So in this situation, Srinath, he is an Indian citizen and he is stay in India only for the period of 100 days. Then he will be considered as non-resident. Next point was, what would be your answer if Srinath has visited for 120 days instead of 100 days every year? So in this situation, if Mr. Srinath comes in India for the period of 120 days, if Mr. Srinath, he comes or he stay in India for the period of 120 days and his income excluding foreign income is more than 15 lakh rupees. more than 15 lakh rupees, then he will be considered as resident of India. He will be considered as, or he will be deemed as resident of India for the previous year 20 and 21. If his total income does not exceed, if his total income does not exceed 15 lakh, then he will not be considered as a resident of India because he is staying in India less than 182 days. Because he is staying in India for the period of less than 182 days, he will be considered as non-resident. He will be considered as non-resident if his income is less than 15 lakh. Next example, Mr. B, a Canadian citizen, comes to India for the first time during the previous year 2016-17. During the financial year 2016-17, 17-18, 18-19, 19-20, and 20 and 21, he was in India for the 55 days, 60 days, 90 days, 150 days, or 70 days, respectively. So, on the basis of this, determine the relevant status of the assessee. As per the condition number 2, if there is any person who is stay in India for the period of immediately preceding 4th financial year, more than, for 365 days or more than 365 days, and at least 60 days in the relevant previous year, then such person will be considered as, a resident of India. But in this situation, Mr. B, he is still in India in the relevant previous year for the period of 70 days, which is more than 60 days. And during the preceding 4 years, he stayed in India only for the period of 355 days. Only for the period of 355 days, which is less than 365 days, So in this situation, Mr. B will be considered as non-resident. He will be considered as non-resident for the previous year 20 and 21. He will be considered as non-resident if he stay in India in preceding 4 years for the period of 365 or more than 365, then he will be considered as resident of India. But according to this situation, he is in India only for 355 days. He will not be considered as resident of India. He will be considered as non-resident. He will be considered as non-resident for the previous year 20 and 21. So on the basis of such example, we have understand who will be considered as a resident of India and non-resident of India. Means on the basis of stay of period, how we will determine the residential status of the assessee. So on the basis of such class, we have understand the residential status of individual. To calculate the amount of taxable income of the assessee, the residential status is very much important, because when we know about whether he is a resident or he is non-resident, we will determine the income which will be taxable in India or which will not be taxable in India. So kindly consider and kindly revise all the provision of this chapter, of this topic, so that you can properly understand each and every provision. Thank you so much for watching this video. Okay, bye bye.